Thank you all for your time today. Really appreciate the opportunity. And on behalf of Cabot's premium Woodcare brands, we're delighted to be presenting this webinar this morning. Feel free to add your questions as we go along, and feel free to maybe reach out if need to longer term with regard to your finishing requirements. Just to give you a bit of an overview on the, we are part of the Dulux business. And again, we're covered off by a wide range of brands and technologies throughout the local market and across the world. Some brands of which you may be familiar with the likes of Dulux, Porter's Paints, Cabot, Intergrain, Parkem, Yates. Our portfolio of products is wide and varied, but being part of the Dulux Construction Solutions business, we're a business unit of that, which is under the Cabot's premium Woodcare brands, of which we cover off the Intergrain, Cabot's, Feast Watson brands, as well as Technos, EnviroPro, and also some application equipment through CTEC. For today's presentation, the learning outcomes are ultimately to understand the differences between timber oil, stains and clears, understand the benefits of pre-oiled timber, identify and specify the coatings for internal and external timber elements, and also understand the ongoing care and maintenance requirements for natural timber. So why would we unearth even coat timber in the first place? Typically, this is an organic material, and unfortunately, like most organic materials, they want to return to where they came from. So part of what we do in the timber finishing industry is also about enhancing the natural beauty of timber, providing UV resistance and to stop degradation and oxidization, minimise and eliminate structural deterioration of the timber, provide protection against water ingress and potential damage, stop decay of the timber and provide durability to the substrate, resist mold, algae, fungi, and ultimately sealing up the pores of the timber grain, protect the timber from mechanical damage, be it foot traffic, and also ease of long-term maintenance, which we'll all cover today. To give you a bit of an overview on timber finishes, we'll cover in this element timber oils, pre-oils, timber stains, and timber clears. So three common types of timber oils. There are mineral-based oils. Typically, these are petrochemical-based. They help penetrate deeply into the fibres of the timber, prevent cupping and warping, and can also be tinted to protect from UV. Oil-based timber oils, which are more naturally derived, pretty much will do the same thing. They penetrate the surface, they help prevent cupping and warping, and also can be tinted. But also there are water-based oils as well. These are modified oils that can be dispersed in water. They're usually mixed with a small component of a synthetic polymer such as acrylic. These partially penetrate the surface. They give film-forming properties. They also help reducing cupping and warping of the timber, and typically are already pigmented to protect from UV. And being a water-based technology, these technologies offer lower VOC levels. So we're looking at products that are much lower than traditional oil-based and mineral oil-based oils. Pre-oiled timber are typically merchant applied oils. This is typically a single coat application. The idea is to protect the timber prior to transport, storage, fabrication, and installation. The key being that we want to make sure that the timber is free from any water staining or anything like that. So typically the oil will help significantly reduce those effects. They deeply penetrate to protect from within. They safeguard against structural deterioration during that storing process, and in some instances can actually prevent tannin migration depending on the species of timber. One of our products, Intergrain Universal Timber Oil, is actually quite a unique product, being an oil-based product where you can pre-oil your componentry, but it can still be applied, site-applied with any of our oil or water-based technologies to give long-term durability, with it being what we call an unlock system, unlike traditional oils, which you can really only apply an oil to the surface as well. Something to keep in mind. Covering off timber stains, there are interior and exterior grades. These stain products are designed to change the appearance of timber. They're transparent or semi-transparent finishes. They typically have a range of pigments added to them to change that colour. They penetrate the surface to change the fibres of the timber, and are typically brush, roller or rag applied. And something to bear in mind that most stains, if they're interior grade, usually only single coat application. They're non-film forming, meaning that they don't provide a surface protection, and generally speaking will require some form of clear coat film forming system to protect it on the surface. Exterior stains are a little bit different. These are more of a stain and varnish type product. They offer excellent protective qualities to that of a traditional exterior coating, and they provide UV resistance, water repellence, wear resistance without the need for a top coat clear as for long-term protection. We can also, with these types of finishes, because they're film forming, we can also put anti-slip additives in for decking and so forth. So something to consider there. Clear timber finishes. The easiest way to think about clear finishes when we talk about clear coatings is think about a paint without any pigments or any colour. These are typically film forming. They're both solvent and water-based options available to provide protection to stained and natural timber for interior. And exterior clears contain UV absorbers and are slightly pigmented to provide durability. Quite often I am asked a question about why can't we just have a clear for exterior? The reality is that if we put a slight tint in it, it'll actually maintain the colour of the base timber much longer. So the colour will tend to send most timbers much deeper in tone. So just, again, something to be mindful of. And again, there are multiple uses with these clear coatings. When we look at clear oils, as I mentioned a little earlier, most are solvent or water-based, typically non-filming, so they penetrate the film, they penetrate the timber, sorry. They can be used internally and externally. Clear timber oils will still nourish, protect, and provide water repellents to the base timber. But clear oils, being a clear option, will also allow the timber to naturally silver over time. So if that's part of your design intent, be it historically a coastal type project where we're looking for that weathered grey silver look, you can still achieve that whilst also providing the structural stability for the timber longer term. But there are also durable colour post additives that can be put into these oils to maintain colour for much longer as well. Again, something to consider during the specification process. So how do timber finishing systems work? Let's take a step back into the composition of timber oils, because they are quite similar to paints. Typically, we have a resin or solids, what we know as a carrier medium in the industry. This forms the backbone to the coating system, be it an oil, be it a clear finish, or a tinted coating. There are a range of additives that are also added into the mix. These typically will cover off flexibility, gloss level. It'll also include a range of pigments and a range of other additives that can also improve film performance. And then we have the solvents. These solvents can be either petrochemical based or water based, depending on the coating system and obviously the resin system. And again, these are used to ultimately thin or reduce the coating. Most products will already provide what we call ready for use, but if in the instance some coatings need to be sprayed, then they can be thinned accordingly with the relative material. To cover off the timber finishing cycle, we go through the application process with paints, be it solvent or oil-based. There's a blend of resins and solvents, as too with the oils. They penetrate into the coating. Obviously, the paints will sit a little bit more on the surface, but still penetrate, whereas the oils will penetrate much deeper into that base substrate. After application comes the evaporation process. Most single pack paints will rely on solvent evaporation, be that water or an oil-based solvent, to evaporate out the film to provide a cohesive finish. With the exception of two-pack finishes, which rely on a catalytic reaction, which causes the film to harden. There's still a little bit of solvent evaporation, but typically they use a slightly different curing mechanism. But for this example, we're talking about single-pack systems for that. They ultimately, once the solvents have evaporated, the pigment, resin, and the oils provides a barrier from UV, protecting the timber cell structure. It prevents staining, mold, and also fungi and contamination, and obviously prevents dirt retention. Now, over time, with long-term exposure to UV, chemical attack from chemical fallout, things like that, geographic location, wind blasting, even mechanical damage, the coatings will break down over time. This will leave the coating probably a little bit more vulnerable to oxidation, drying out, greying and cracking. And in some instances, if you have specified clear coatings in the past, those UV absorbers will actually break down over time and then will require refurbishing. And part of that finishing cycle is then to strip back, reapply and go through the whole process again. Timber finishing performance. This is just to give you a bit of an idea of what we at Cabot's actually do with a lot of our coatings. They're developed for local and also overseas environments. Being in Australia, we're subject to quite a few environmental conditions. We independently test through NADA accredited laboratories and we assess UV, humidity, temperature, moisture and exposure. These are typically tested at Allunga and Tully in Queensland. Although we've had a lot of rain up in Queensland at the moment, certainly Allunga has the higher levels of UV up there with an average of 310 days per annum, whereas Tully regards the highest and wettest levels of rainfalls within Australia, and I know that's significantly different at the moment. But ultimately, we're testing a lot of our products to the very extremes. We also do some in-house testing, both in Clayton, Victoria, and also Wellington in New Zealand, just to give us a bit of a broad brush of what we can do internally with our technical benefits as well. So we do test our products to make sure that they're independently assessed and we can make the correct claims about our products, which is critical. Just to give you a bit of an idea of what this all means from a performance perspective, on the image on the left there covers off oil-based and water-based oils. As you can see, the mineral oil-based oil tends to break down quite significantly after 6 months. With the oil, the more natural-based oil tends to retain colour a little bit longer after that 6-month period. And then the water-based oil, because of its component of acrylic within the finish, tends to retain film and colour much, much longer. And again, some of you might be wondering, why is it only 6 months over at Allunga? Given it's such a critical environment in which we test these materials, we can then extrapolate a rough idea on how they're going to perform in general exposure areas across the country. Also, with the exterior performance of timber clear coats, we do a testing up to 12 months at Allunga. As you can see, the difference is on a high quality, high performance UV absorbed clear versus a substandard clear system will start to break down and cause issues within that 12-month period. As you can see on that far right image, the water ingress and potential for mold is already starting to take place with film starting to crack. So building in flexibility within an external clear is quite critical. Product specification. This is probably the most critical part about selecting the most ideal product for end-use application. So exterior components, what to specify, and again, to consider pre-oiled timber as the first part of any specification that can be done through the timber merchant. And it's quite important, as we touched base on a little earlier, that having pre-oiled timber can certainly reduce issues with handling, transportation, storage on site, water ingress and so forth. So something well worth considering, but also considering long-term maintenance of what that exterior components are going to be subjected to, durability requirements, whether you want a stained or natural colour to be retained, or whether that silvering effect or what we call denaturing is the design intent in which you're looking for. The accessibility to the components when they're installed, something that often is a little overlooked, particularly when clear films are applied. Also, ease of preparation and ease of application during that exterior specification should also be covered off. So as a general rule of thumb, with clear timber coatings, generally recommend that window frames and doors, soffits, and generally components that can be easily prepared and refurbished in situ certainly should be considered, as well as non-slip decking and stair treads. Again, I see a lot of specifications coming through with timber oils, with a specification for a non-slip additive. Because oils are non-film forming, that actually doesn't work. And I do see a lot of specifications where rough sawn timber is specified, on timber decking, which won't give you a minimum P4 slip rating. It's non-quantifiable and certainly should be considered for clear film forming or film forming stain products that have the slip resistant additive included. Timber oils can also be a cost-effective alternative to long-term ongoing care and maintenance. Whilst the performance of these products aren't necessarily in the same league as most of the exterior grade timber coatings, pre-oiled timbers and materials can be applied to cladding, structural GLT and CLT, or glue laminated and cross-laminated timbers, landscape features and furniture, and anything that's exposed to direct UV contact. I generally recommend a timber oil being specified for the ease of application and accessibility. From an interior perspective, again, we mentioned about considering pre-oiled timber, and again, that does protect against on-site handling and damage. But also, like external applications, regard the durability requirements and trafficability and UV exposure. Whilst some timber will be placed up against glass, there's still some level of UV transmission. Most interior cleared type systems generally won't have the level of UV absorbed as an exterior grade product will. And again, we can guide you on the best product for that best specification, but also understanding the colour requirements through stains and the like, but also accessibility to components, ease of preparation and application. Again, we need to make sure that they're easily accessed so they can be maintained at some point in the future. So clear timber coatings for internal applications, pretty much well everywhere. There's certainly no issues with that. Slip resistance for decking and stair treads, and obviously with clear timber coatings, if we're looking at water-based systems that need to be applied on site, that need to meet Green Star, WELL certification, LEED and the like, as part of those construction criteria, we'll be looking at low or ultra-low VOC type water-based systems as an alternative. Timber oils, again, certainly can recommend the pre-oiled material. Most internal applications where timber oils are suitable, but think in the point of on-site application that most timber oils will typically have a higher VOC content, with the exception of water-based products, and it's just something that will need to be considered during that specification process. To give you a bit of an overview, this is just a snapshot of some timber finishing elements that we've been working on over the time, and to give you a bit of a working example of what's been specified. So typically during the finishing schedule, we would recommend that factory applied pre-oiled timber through the timber merchant is recommended. Obviously, if a water-based top coat is required, then a reference to an unlocked coating system is quite critical. And also, it's well worth checking with the manufacturers that you're considering that their clear oils are suitable for application with water-based top coats. And again, if anybody needs any further assistance or design support with those sorts of recommendations, more than happy to help. Feel free to reach out if and when you need to. Also, for on-site application, making reference to the water-based products. So in this particular example, we were looking at a pre-oiled glulam beam with a water-based clear coat on site to be applied as well. So again, making sure that we've got all those requirements covered off is quite important. And obviously the internal use of on-site water-based products and stains, and noting the VOC requirements more specifically. Maintenance recommendations. This is one that does come up a lot in discussions, and obviously certain considerations need to be considered when we're looking at specifying external and internal timber for that matter. And no timber finish is ever set and forget. And for that matter, no coating is ever set and forget. They're all subject to external stress factors, such as your geographic locations, exposure and orientation to UV. Oxidation is always critical with coating systems, and that oxidation should be removed during that cleaning process at the very least. Chemical exposure, there's sea salts, acid rain and so forth. Also temperature variation, depending on the location of the building, that needs to be considered as well, as it can have an effect on drying out of timbers, causing timbers to crack over time and that sort of thing. Water ingress is quite critical. Denaturing and or silvering, as I mentioned a little earlier. If it's not the design intent, what colour we're going to be selecting for the stain. Also, drying out of that timber and mechanical damage of the timber, be it wear from handrails, flooring, stair treads, and so on. So managing your ongoing care and maintenance of all timber finishes is absolutely critical. So frequent cleaning and inspection of external timber is always necessary. We always recommend using a cleaner specifically formulated for timber cleaning, although a mild soap detergent is also suitable. Inspection maintenance frequency schedule should be determined and agreed on by the property owner, typically depending on geographic location and environmental conditions. And those inspections and maintenance frequencies typically range between 6 months and 2 years. Although for me personally, I prefer to spec it between every 6 months to every year to make sure that a particular area of a building is not showing any signs of degradation. In those instances, we typically recommend identifying those areas of concern and then treat those areas of concern once we see those differences in the performance of the finish. And that might be affected by the repellence of the water, any slight colour change, anything that's first starting to show signs of some level of degradation is quite critical to make sure that that's covered. And ensuring the right product is specified for the maintenance is the same and or compatible for ongoing future maintenance. As we mentioned, some oils are designed to take water-based systems, some oils are designed not. Making sure we've got the right product for the right end-use application is quite critical. And we've also put together a care and maintenance schedule on the far right-hand side there, just to give you a bit of an idea. If anybody does want some more information on what to recommend and what to specify for care and maintenance, please feel free to reach out, either through Wood Solutions or through myself direct, and we can provide you with that detail and specification information. Internal applications, very familiar, or very similar rather, to that of exterior, although other areas that will require the maintenance inspection regimes to be much less frequency, but also need to be considered, are areas of high trafficability. So that would be your handrails that are timber, those areas that might come in contact with heavy foot traffic also needs to be covered off. The general cleanliness, cleaning the dust and cobwebs from the surface, damage from external influences such as water ingress, if there are any weak points in the structure over time where there's been water leaks, but also considering potential UV damage through the transmission on glass, depending on the supply of the glass. And we always make recommendations that if you are specifying timber under glass areas, that you talk with the glass supplier to understand the UV transmission of the grades of glass that are being specified, and also take appropriate action during those recommendations for care and maintenance to make sure that we've got those covered. Also, maintenance regimes also agreed on and agreed on commensurate with the internal traffic and or cleanliness requirements of the actual building, and also the requirements of the property owner as well. So something just to keep mindful of as well. So to give you a bit of a review on the differences of the timber oils, stains and clears, hopefully you understand the benefits of pre-oiled timber and where that fits in the specification channel. Identify and specify coatings for interior and exterior timber elements, and understanding the ongoing care and maintenance requirements of natural timber. Thank you all again for your time. Please feel free to keep the questions coming through. More than happy to stay online as needed and answer questions. And I'll throw back to Alistair. Over to you, Alistair.
So thanks for that, Gareth. That was an excellent presentation and lots of great information in there. I was actually keen just to start on a question about the pre-oiling, which you mentioned, which is such an important one, and people should take advantage of that specification, particularly that benefits of ensuring that you get, all of the sides of and all the faces of an element sort of pre-oiled before it goes to site. What's your thoughts on that?
Look, it's quite important, and again, making sure that, and from our perspective as a manufacturer, it's quite important to make sure that during the process of pre-oiling, it's quick, it's simple, and these materials can withstand the requirements of being stackable, and that's the critical part. As soon as they're oiled, they can be stacked, packed, and sent to site, which, from our perspective, offers a much quicker, a much more sensible finishing option longer term. And again, making sure, and I'm sure a lot of people out there have had projects where the timber's been stored, the wrapping's blown off over time, and there's been moisture ingress, or alternatively, somebody's wrapped the timber up in a plastic film that's non-breathable, and we can create microclimates in timber. You can get the development of mold spores within that timber, forcing its way into the timber. You'll never get rid of it. So pre-oiling makes sense simply from that perspective as well.
Thanks for that. Look, I'd just like to address a comment that Chris has made on here up front. He's made more an observation. Wood Solutions generally does allow sales promotions, which is what this presentation is, with some general comments thrown in. But I chatted with Gareth about this. Certainly that this isn't a specific Cabot's presentation at all, except that Cabot's is probably one of the biggest producers of these products in the marketplace. So we're certainly talking generically about the different products as we're going through this presentation. So I certainly sort of hope the audience didn't feel that way. I thought it was very generic in a sense, though you're obviously relating to some of the products that you guys produce. But that's important that we do talk generically about the different finishing products that are out there. But actually, there's an interesting question here from Kim. Client wants a black weatherboard finish. Can you recommend a stain and protective finish to ensure longevity of colour?
Yeah, look, we've got a couple of products. We recently released a black Japan product through our industrial business. Fabulous looking product, gathering a lot of momentum to create that char look. Certainly happy to provide on details. We've also got a range of stain and varnish type products for exterior durability that can also provide those performance requirements as well. So happy to provide you specific details outside of this forum as well.
Yeah, it's an interesting question to get that black look, like the sort of Shosugi barn charred look. But yeah, but sort of dark colours, obviously, in terms of absorbing light, aren't the best thing for finishes and things like light colours, obviously giving it a bit longer of a lifetime. Another question here from Steve Harvey about what comments do you have on tung oil, which is certainly another product out there.
Look, tung oil is a lovely oil. I love it. It's a naturally based oil. It provides good structural stability to the timber, and for all intents and purposes, most of our oil-based products typically have a tung oil ingredient, as well as a few other additives that I can't divulge, obviously. But yeah, very good oil for that, and a little bit more naturally and sustainably sourced. And also understanding that with traditional oil-based oils, they're based on petrochemicals, so based on crude oil. They typically don't dry, whereas tung oil will actually penetrate the surface, leaving the surface dry to touch, whereas the oil-based products will actually provide a sticky surface over time, and obviously propagate dirt retention, mold growth, and so on.
Thanks, Gareth. A question here from Benjamin, which is a question that does come up quite regularly about after cutting structural and non-structural timbers, what end grain protection do you recommend? I mean, that's such a critical thing. If the timber's been protected and all of a sudden that sort of coating is cut and water can penetrate.
Look, it depends on what coating system we're looking at. Of course, there are also normal paint systems that can be recommended. We certainly recommend at the very least something like universal timber oils applied to protect the end grain. We also have a range of end grain sealers that are available as well, and there are some wax-based products. The wax-based products can be a little problematic, particularly if you're coating over the top of the entire component where you've got your cut edges, and obviously you can have issues with coating adhesion and so on. So just something to be mindful of. If you do need further assistance with looking at suitable end grain protection, just reach out and provide that assistance.
Yep. You mentioned a couple of times during your presentation, particularly with decks, about the importance of non-slip surfaces and coatings. So what's your suggestions, particularly for exterior use for things like steps and ramps and those type of applications?
My general recommendation for these types of applications is a film forming system. We've got a range of decking finishes which are suitable for all applications that have either built-in anti-slip additives, or all we have the opportunity of putting in an aggregate that can be stirred into the material and then applied. So again, they've all been tested to meet minimum P4 and P5 slip resistance, depending on the application as well. So for me, film forming coatings are the best for these types of applications. It may mean that care and maintenance is probably a little bit simpler in that the need to repaint these will be much less than an oil system in this type of application. So certainly for the performance requirements, I'd recommend a film forming system.
Yep. Interesting question here from Stephen, just in terms of large bridge and wharf type hardwoods. So, you know, that are quite, 300 by 300 mil, so quite big, but also generally, because they're so big, they're generally got fairly high moisture content still there. They're still quite green. But what, there are products out there, or how do you approach coating those type of products with a high moisture content? And can you actually do that when they're over a beach or an ocean?
Yeah, look, it's always an interesting one. Usually the larger the types of timber, I'm seeing a lot more specifications for that type of end-use application where the timber is being provided pre-seasoned. Generally, we can recommend oiling of those materials, although we would suggest that a timber moisture content is performed before application, and that's somewhere sort of around about between 10 and 17% level before you can pre-oil from there, or oil in general. But a lot of those sorts of applications, I'm starting to see just pre-seasoned timber being specified.
We chatted about this earlier on about it's difficult to give advice around sort of maintenance times because it's sort of certainly, it's dependent on the geography and the place that you're building. But the question from Karen about what is the durability or design life for the first major maintenance you give to stains and varnishes, and sort of what's your recommended frequency of those sort of minor and major maintenance activities?
Yeah, that's always a cracking question, and you'll probably see me ducking and weaving because we can't always control the environments in which these components are always installed. We know that in general terms, film forming type systems for timber can last anywhere from 2 years to 6 or 7 years in general terms. But we do recommend that regular care and maintenance, simple cleaning will be enough to maintain the aesthetics of a coating system. And we recommend that, depending on the location, say for a coastal, a visual inspection and maybe a light clean every 6 months to 12 months. And then based on that, for inland areas, every 12 months to 15 months inspection and clean. And as I mentioned in the presentation, identifying those areas that are going to start to show some levels of degradation, understanding that some areas of a building will degrade quicker than others because of its orientation to UV and the weather and all of the influencing factors that can be problematic, and then addressing those matters pretty much as soon as they appear. So having your property services manager and going through their maintenance regimes and including that is something to consider quite seriously.
Mm-hmm. There was a question here sort of about specific recommendations and considerations for applications on plywood. I imagine that's probably not much different to other types of timbers.
Very similar. It really does depend on what sort of end-use application. I'd see a lot of applications for plywoods and sophites, wall paneling and sometimes ceiling paneling. In those instances, we typically recommend, depending on what the design intent of the building was, we typically recommend a film forming clear or a stain and clear over the top. It really does depend on the type of end-use application. And of course, as most of you may or may not know, we certainly have grades of marine grade plywood, which basically means that the glue in that gives good repellents to water, not necessarily makes the wood repellent to water. So making sure we've got that covered off is also important.
There was a question also here just about protecting cut-treated pine. So look, I imagine if it's treated pine for that durability reason, it'd be using sort of some similar finish to give you that treatment. But actually, it's an interesting question, I suppose, about using finishes actually on treated pine. Does that impact upon it at all?
Look, generally not. We certainly, our oil products are suitable for treating for treated pine, although with those oil products, you won't get the protection you will from an LSOP type treated timber product. It's more about providing a resistance to moisture ingress and so forth. So depending on that type of application, whether they're looking for a painted finish or a clear finish or even an oil finish, it really just does depend on the end use application. But at the very least, certainly cut edges of treated pine, for example, certainly a good slab of universal timber oil or something to that effect would be ideal.
There's an interesting question here from Steph, just asking about what products to use with double glazed windows. So can you recommend what products we should be specifying when coating, staining double glazed windows? I know some products have issues with the silicon between the glazing, which can void the window warranties.
Absolutely, and I'm glad it's been raised, because this comes across my desk quite a lot. What do we specify? It's already been specified as an oil. Typically, we would recommend film forming clears for this. So you would recommend, if you were staining the timber work, certainly stain it, follow the manufacturer's directions, and then clear coat to seal it, both internally and externally. My personal preference is to recommend an exterior grade film forming clear, both internally and externally, if that's the design intent of the building, purely because you'll get a little bit extra protection from UV degradation, but also, and more importantly, you'll get good adhesion of the silicon and urethane sealants that are used to seal windows and so forth. So just something to consider as well.
A question here on sort of use of timber internally. So for timber kitchen bench tops, what types of oil finishes would you recommend for timber kitchen bench tops?
We certainly, as a manufacturer, have a range of products. They're usually polyurethane based. We have a clear finish for bench tops, which has been tested to meet specific food grade standards and child health standards. Happy to provide more detail and assistance after this, more specifically if it's required. Happy to do that.
And a question here from Tower. In terms of sealing hardwood timber cladding, is something like marine grade varnish, is this the best in terms of longevity and reapplication?
It's an interesting question, and there's no such coating as a marine grade varnish in reality. Usually it's based on the technology base and depending on the end use application. Personally, if I was asked to specify a product, particularly if it's hardwood, a hardwood cladding system, I'd more err towards an oil, just for the ease of maintenance longer term. But you can certainly offer up a film forming system that we would typically use on a decking system. So they provide superior exterior performance, some good trafficability if it's ever required, certainly not necessarily on some vertical surfaces, but the durability and performance of what's being used on a deck can also be used on a vertical surface, such as this sort of cladding.
I think this sort of discussion around maintenance is such a critical one, and managing people's expectations when they're using timber externally, and be keen to perhaps explore that a little bit more with you about the advice that you give. I mean, you mentioned before about how often you really should go out and inspect. You were saying sort of 6 to 12 months, or you're recommending that 6 months to 2 years, which I totally agree. I mean, particularly when using things that are film forming finishes, because you know they're great, but one of the problems with that is you can't often see what's happening underneath the surface. If there's a crack somewhere and water's penetrated, the film forming finish sometimes hides that, and you know you've got stuff happening. It looks good on the outside, but not so good underneath. So maybe you want to explore a little bit more about the advice you give around you know, managing people's expectations around the right things to do around maintenance.
And it's a great point too, Alistair. It's one of those things, it's hugely emotive. And because there's such a wide grade of different finishing systems with different substrates across the marketplace, there's already an expectation that a coating of some form will provide a level of durability that could be, you know, 5, 10, 15, 20, and sometimes 30 years with some of the coatings I've worked on over the years. When we start dealing with coatings that are specifically designed for timber, we need to consider the fact that, particularly for external and sometimes internal environments, that coatings do move. The substrate, being timber, will move over time. So developing and building a product that moves with that timber, that expands, it contracts, but also provides UV stability and minimal degradation over time is absolutely critical. What can happen with film forming clears over time And I probably ask of everybody, if they're driving home tonight, you'll probably see a car in the traffic where the clear coat is starting to break down on the roof or on the bonnet or on the boot. That's typical of a UV absorber that breaks down, which does happen over time. And being mindful of that within any care and maintenance recommendation is always critical. And I always use that example when I'm talking to builders, property owners, and also architects on the design and the recommendation for finishing systems. So my recommendation, depending on the end use application and where it's installed, will always be based around an oil or a film forming clear. It'll always cover off a recommendation for some general cleaning. So there is some general maintenance just for aesthetics more than anything else. And this is something that's no different in the facade finishing industry. I spent a lot of time in that industry over the years, explaining the need for care and maintenance. You've got to remove any surface-borne contaminants from any coating. And it's something that needs to be considered depending on the location of the building as well. So from that sort of maintenance perspective, I've drawn on that experience over many years and transferred that into where we go with wood coatings. And that would always be, I can't always give you a guarantee of how long that coating will last over timber, being a natural substrate. But what I can tell you that if you have a regular care and maintenance regime built within the information that's provided to the builder, for instance, to pass on to the client, if that's built in within their documentation, then that's going to give you a lot more chance of reducing long-term coating. And maintenance is relatively simple and straightforward, being like a mild wash with a detergent and usually a brush down and something as simple as that. When we start looking at oils, it becomes a little bit more tricky because their long-term durability probably isn't the same as a clear finish. But generally speaking, oils are much easier to refurbish and repaint than they are with clear finishes. And just bear in mind also that if we're talking about a clear finish that's been installed, let's use the example of the weatherboarding. Over time, that clear coat starts breaking down. At some point, you're going to have to strip off all of that clear coat and start with the bare timber. Where timber oils are ideal for this application is we typically recommend a good clean down with some proprietary timber cleaners. There's two that we use. Pressure cleaning the timber back to its natural colour and then reapplying oil from there. And usually that's enough to sustain the building for another couple of years moving forward. So depending on that application, depending on the geographic location, which I do keep banging on about, but these are matters that need to be considered during the specification process, are quite critical in understanding what product's going to be best for the end use application, but also for long-term maintenance as well.
Mm. Thanks for that. I think that's really important to the participants online today who are going to be specifying these products for their customers, and they need to understand and, manage the expectation of their clients about the maintenance program and realise it needs to be done. And reminding everyone that, maintenance is required for all materials, not just timber, steel, sort of concrete, all of those require maintenance over time. It's about getting that schedule sort of correctly implemented. So people online, we've still got time for some questions, so throw them out there. This won't get us an opportunity like this to get somebody so knowledgeable as Gareth to answer your questions if you got them. He's doing a great job at the moment. Look, there's a question here, which is an interesting one, coming about the use of hardwood claddings in bushfire areas and appropriate finishes. Maybe answer that in twofold, if you wouldn't mind. Is there an issue with your normal finishes in bushfire areas, if there's any sort of fire effect? But also, I don't know if you've got any thoughts around any fire-resistant additives to finishes and whether that sort of helps in bushfire zones.
Yeah, look, and it's a highly emotive subject as well, not only for bushfire zones, but also for timber finishes that go on cladding as well. We're working through a range of technologies within our portfolio of products at the moment just to substantiate the requirements for propagation of flame, as they call it. One of those things that we need to be mindful of a manufacturer is that the coating systems that we use don't propagate flames, quite critical. But also looking at finishing systems, and I can't allude too much at the moment, but there are finishing systems, and we are working on finishing systems that can provide some level of intumescency moving forward. It's a bit of watch this space, but in general terms, fire protection for these types of applications is a huge consideration. There are products already available out in the marketplace that can do this. What I've found is that looking for coating systems that offer an aesthetic benefit, but also give the protective qualities of an intumescent type finish, very, very difficult to achieve. But as I say, watch this space. We've got some exciting technology coming out, and I certainly hope to be presenting something aside from a CPD presentation where I can bang on about how great our products are.
Got a couple of good questions here about use of timber and treatments in sort of areas which are a bit more sort of high risk. So the first one, in terms of use, the best treatment for coastal residential cladding. So assuming here, obviously, the client's not wanting the timber to grey back to that grey type look, which is very popular in a coastal area. But if you were wanting to maintain that sort of natural look of the timber, are there specific ones that you would be using, you know, that you'd recommend in that coastal area where it's a much sort of harsher environment?
Very much so. Look, the options, the two main options that we could probably consider in this, particularly if colour was critical. We could certainly recommend some of our film forming clears, some of our decking grade products are pretty ideal for this. The difference that we would see with a specification in this sort of environment would typically be, instead of a 2-coat system, we would recommend a 3-coat system based on recommended square metre rate applications that are outlined in our technical data sheets. That will be sufficient enough to provide relatively long-term protection. But in these types of applications where buildings are subjected to some significant stress factors like sea salts, we would be recommending that care and maintenance is performed quite frequently. So within that sort of 6 month, I'd even go as far, depending on the location of the building, it may even be a 3-month regime. A simple wash down with a mild detergent. And, you know, as I mentioned a little earlier, we have some proprietary technologies. Hose on, hose off, that's good enough to protect and maintain the aesthetics of the building. Saying that, we can also go to timber oils, but it just will mean that there'll be a little bit more maintenance short term. But again, based on colour retention, we can still look at that as well.
Yep. So the other sort of high sort of environment was a question about around timber decking used around pools these days, which is obviously quite popular. Yeah, is there specific sort of requirements around pools where I guess you're getting a lot of water and chemicals that are coming out of the pool?
Look, the chemistry bases that we've got are usually pretty good for chemical protection. Like with anything, as a coating manufacturer, if anything's exposed to any level of chemical, we'd recommend cleaning that off as soon as possible. Because again, anything that can sit on the surface for long periods of time is going to degrade any coating. So we would make that same recommendation to say, look, any areas that are exposed to pool chemicals, that sort of thing, certainly rinse it clean, and that'll be enough to protect it. Depending on the requirement around the swimming pools, I'd probably be recommending some non-slip decking coating, film forming coating systems rather than an oil in this application, simply because you're looking for that performance requirement of minimum P4. And I mean, I saw somebody's made a mention about recommendations about P4 and P5. We do have additives and products that will meet those standards. We also have independent testing to substantiate that testing as well. So one of those things, as I mentioned earlier, where with decking in particular, that I've seen a lot of specifications where people have been specifying rough sawn with an oil treatment. It simply doesn't provide a quantifiable result for long-term slip resistance, whereas a film forming system that has a built-in aggregate to help stop slip resistance is quite important.
I love this question from Jonathan here. I pondered this myself. I've got a beautiful spotted gum sort of screen wall around my spa and a deck around it, and I look after it each year, just give it a couple of coats. But Jonathan's asked, do more coats, more than instructed, make a difference in longevity of coating systems? I always wonder that if I whack another coat on, is that going to actually mean I don't have to do it so often, or will it really not make much difference after you do what's actually been instructed?
Yeah, look, it's a good question, and look, we'd always, as a paint company, we'd always say put more and more coats on. Let's keep it going. But the reality is that it becomes a point in which too much of a good thing's not so good. Generally speaking, that what we recommend is a maintenance coat every 12 months to 2 years, and certainly areas around a spa or a swimming pool where you've got a lot of chemicals, we recommend a minimum 3 coats for that type of application. But in general terms, yeah, look, at some point in the future, the coatings will start, you'll have a significant amount of coating on that timber. It will eventually need to be stripped off and started from scratch again, the reality, or otherwise scrap the timber and then redo it from there. That's usually quite a time down in the future, but in general terms, yeah, too many coats can also mean a lot of problems as well, longer term.
Fantastic. And look, a question here on tannin leaching, which is a bit of a problem. Mentioning it is a common thing, particularly with some Pacific type hardwoods, you get a lot of leaching coming out of those. Is there any recommendations around sealing it, or what's your thoughts there? I mean, often it is just sort of knowing it's going to leach and being able to sort of clean it up as part of your maintenance schedule.
Yeah, really, really good question. We make a range of recommendations. We do have a range of primers and sealers that are solvent based to stop this. The problem with tannins is they're typically dissolvable in water, hence why they leach out. When you apply a solvent-based coating over the top, it tends to lock them in there. There are no 100% guarantees that you'll lock it in, but it'll safeguard to some degree of minimising that. We do have a range of cleaning products which are oxalic acid based, which are designed to spray on the surface, leave it for a period of probably half an hour to an hour, and it'll actually draw those tannins out and you simply wash them off. There's some fantastic products I'd love to bang on about that will help reduce that, and certainly reduce the need to age or weather a timber that does have a high tannin content. It certainly helps improve that time, particularly if you're on a building site. Somebody specified a type of timber that has a high tannin content. Preparing it with these types of materials like the oxalic acid and then neutralising with a specific cleaner will certainly speed that process up. The results actually are truly astounding. I've had some experience in the laboratories playing with these technologies, and certainly speeds the process.
Yep. Look, we've had a good last question or comment here, which I might just refer to from Mark just at the end, that I know today's presentation's all been about the sort of coating and protection of timber, but Mark does point out the importance of selecting the correct timbers for external use. So the right timber, whether it's a class 1, class 2 type product, or even if it's a treated product, if it's a non-class 1 and class 2 product, and that really is an important thing. You do need to specify the correct timber based on its natural durability or its preservative treatment, and then obviously the finishing then extends the sort of beauty of the timber or protects it from all of the things you've described today, Gareth. So look, we might finish up there. I want to thank you once again, Gareth, for not just an excellent presentation, but fielding a whole range of excellent questions at the end here as well. So it's been really informative, and certainly I hope the people on board who are watching today, I know they will have taken a lot away from it. So we thank you once again for that.
Thank you for the opportunity. More than happy to help people through if they do need to reach out at any time. Yeah, delighted to be a part of Wood Solutions seminars, and yeah, watch this space. I'm sure there'll be a lot more to come.
Okay, thanks for that. And just a reminder to all those attending today that the webinar will be recorded, including the questions at the end. So if you want to go back and review that or pass it on to your colleagues, just go to the Wood Solutions webpage on the events section and down to the webinar tab. We'd also remind you that Wood Solutions does a range of other resources you'd be interested in, particularly some of the in-focus videos. There's some new ones of those coming out shortly, so keep your eye on that one. And also a reminder that our next fortnightly webinar will be in 2 weeks' time, so the 15th of March. And for that webinar, there's a case study on the German International School, which has been up in Sydney, which is a really exciting project that has developed a whole range of modular CLT classrooms. So I certainly encourage you to tune in for that one in 2 weeks' time. So thank you all once again for joining us today. Have a great week if you're in Queensland. I hope you're not sort of too much impacted by the floods, but yeah, keep well, and we'll see you again in 2 weeks' time.